Folks, a brief note. Take this episode seriously. This is one of the most invigorating conversations we've had in a long time, and it ranges far beyond your typical AI use case exploration to get into the meat and the heart of innovation and problem solving. You do not want to miss a moment.
And with that, over to our guest. Here's Mikkel.
Hi, I'm Mikkel, and I'm the founder of something called Human Activity Laboratory, where we work on understanding anthropology and AI and how humans deal with this whole new world of artificial intelligence. And I'm excited to talk about how AI can be used to understand people better and how anthropology and AI can become something that supports each other rather than be opposites, and how when do you need a human being to understand another human being, and when can a machine actually help you do that?
Mikkel, very excited to have you on. Been looking forward to this conversation and been very much looking forward to introduce you to Jeremy, because I think you guys will really hit it off. So also just excited to be a fly on the wall while you guys kind of geek out.
Great.
Mikkel, maybe, you and our mutual friend, Christian Asperg, have kind of introduced me to the world of anthropology. And I am increasingly convinced that it has a huge and will have a very important impact in how we understand how to use AI better. And I can go into more detail and a bunch of questions around that. But for those who have not studied the science of anthropology, would you kind of just give a little bit of an explainer of what that is and some of your research and your work, and kind of give a little kind of like a 30-second introduction to yourself and the domain?
Yeah. I mean, anthropology is something I've worked with for 25 years, and I have to say applied anthropology, which means studying human culture and studying human beings, and particularly the social world. So what is play? What is illness? What is traffic? What is AI? And how do we construct the world around that? And it's used to understand the meaning of things, in particular in corporate world. Corporations use it when they have no hypothesis about the problem they're solving, particularly. So it's what's called pre-hypothesis science. So imagine Darwin when he went on and wrote his amazing piece on evolution. Before he knew there was a hypothesis about evolution, he went and studied, nature, biology, and then he created the theory of evolution. And anthropology is a little bit the same. We just study people instead of studying flowers and animals. We study human culture. So children, doctors, hospitals, car drivers, dog owners, it could be any kind of human culture. And the key is that it's not psychology. We're not trying to understand the human mind. We're trying to understand humans as social beings. So not so much the study of individuals, but the study of when we're together. So family and kinship and class and gender and all those things are important in anthropology.
Could I ask you, Mikkel, what are some of the tactics that you employ, or some of the tools in your toolkit, so to speak, as a applied anthropologist? If someone's doing blank, I know they're practicing applied anthropology.
Mm. I mean, if you're doing what we would be calling field work, which is going out and studying a particular group of people by being with them, by observing them in their natural habitat, like a scientist would do, then you're doing anthropology. That means if you want to understand, let's say, how do kids play, for example, you'd go to kindergartens and playgrounds and you'd study kids and you'd talk to parents and you'd actually engage in the real world. What is called participatory observation in a scientific word, which means you are participating in a social activity and studying it, like looking what's happening. And I've been in wars. I've been in hospitals during operations. I've been working with train drivers and car drivers and golf instructors and kindergarten teachers and all kinds of people to understand the world from their point of view.
The reason why I was so keen to get you on is, and you can then debunk this thesis and then the podcast will be short.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you guys do well is that you form narratives about people and help, it seems, sometimes people understand the self-narratives they have. And if you are looking at how AI models understands the world, they understand the world through language. And so I'm increasingly convinced that the way that we get more out of AI is to become better of articulate the narratives that we have for ourselves and for what we want. Because without being able to have a very clear narrative about, for example, what we do as a company, and not just what we do, but what we want to be, and what we
Yeah.
feel that we serve and the purpose and all those different things, we have a tough time having AI help us with that. I'll give you an example. Let's say that I describe BarkBox, one of my businesses, to another model, and I say, what is the next product I should build? It would assume that it is 2 treats, 2 toys, and a chew that gets in a box. And because that it wants to be statistically accurate, it most likely will recommend me something that is similar to what I do, not who I want to be. So it will suggest to make a cat box, for example. Now, at Bark, we would never make a cat box. We're not in the business of doing stuff for cats. We're in the business of making dogs and their people happy. So simply by reframing the way that we talk to a model about, we want to make dogs and their people happy, suddenly the model will much better understand what the next step should be for us. And so it seemed to me that anthropologists have had a lot of training in really understanding this narrative creation. And by using the tools of anthropology, we will be better of articulating a company's purpose and strategy, and us as an individual's purpose and strategy for how we will use models better.
Yeah. But that makes
Tell me that I'm
sense.
just directionally correct.
No, yeah, I think there are some nuances to this, because if you want to understand human behavior and human culture and human activity, language is one road. So talking to people is one, and understanding what's been written and how the words they use and what are the meaning of the words they use. There's a lot to learn from that. And anyone who's been in a company for more than a couple of months know that in every company they have their own language. Ford has a very particular language about cars. It's very different from Audi or Volkswagen, for example. And so there is a lot of, gold in understanding language. And I think AI generally does a very, very good job of that, and increasingly better and better as there's more data. But language is only one dimension of human nature. There is also the body. Like, how does things feel? The sensory system. So, how does things smell? So try to explain how something smells is very, very difficult to do with language. Or how does something look? How does, early morning in October in Copenhagen look? You can do it, but you need almost to be like a poet to describe, because it's not just of, words, it's also emotion and what you see with your eyes. And then there's a whole thing around how things feel with your hands, so the sensory. And there's a whole lot of science on this that, basically it says that, we don't think with our brains alone, we think with our bodies. And that's probably something that is not yet fully understood by AI, or where AI has a little bit of a weakness, because it doesn't have a body yet. So I think that's really interesting. We can talk about some of the things I think will be coming soon that I'm excited about. For example, some of the stuff that Google are doing with their Pixel phone that has what's called contextual video. So if I look at you, Jeremy, it would be able to see what books you have in the background and instantly understand what you have read, for example. It can recognize if a dog comes in, that is a dog and not a cat, etc. And when we get that sort of intelligence, I think it's an exponential increase of what we can call intelligence or smartness. That's really interesting. So you have language, Henrik, which is definitely important, but there are other dimensions. And then there's also the whole thing about sociality that I think particularly engineers often forget, that people are extremely connected, that we are born into a world that was already made for us. for example, Denmark, where I'm from, and that gives you, your ethics, your language, your boundaries, what a family is, religion, all kinds of things that are non-negotiable. You're born into that. And you know that all Danes are social democrats, Henrik, and that's because we're born into that. Right. It's such a, you can't escape it. And that's not in language. That is in social pressure and what's called being cultured. So you're being cultured into a specific way of thinking and a morale and behaviors and routines and rituals and things like that. So those things are not just language. It's other things to study. And when we study things, for example, dog owners, we would of course study what they say about their dogs, but we will spend a lot of time figuring out what's happening between a dog and a dog owner, which is super interesting, by the way, how we give them names and how we make them almost human. And we talk about him and her and all of those things, and that is very, very difficult to do just through written language. That you almost need to see it in action to understand what a dog
I
owner
think
is.
that makes a lot of sense. And I
Yeah.
think we had a guest on not too long ago that talked from a technical point of view about that specific thing.
Right.
That it was, the next generation of models, and the way that we get closer to AGI is those kind of things.
Embodied learning, right? Yeah. AGI doesn't smell or taste or.
No.
I was actually, you mentioned Christian Keller, who joined us from Meta, and he was saying that's Jan LeCun's entire criticism of the paradigm that says large language models will get us to AGI is they don't know how something smells or tastes. They know what words we use to describe it,
Yeah.
And I was actually thinking about for example, being full. It's one thing to describe being full or being hungry.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk a lot about hunger, right? But have you been hungry?
Right.
You can read a book about Abraham Lincoln. Do you know Abraham Lincoln, right? There's very different, like to know someone is very different than to study them. To know an experience is very different than you can read all about what it's like to be hungry and desperation, but unless you've actually experienced hunger, it's a totally different kind of knowledge. So I'm right there with you. Mikkel, where I went immediately is this question of to what end, meaning if you think about applied anthropology, you mentioned it's fascinating what we learn about dog owners and dog people. And my question is to what end? And maybe just to level up one level for folks like me who are new to this field, I'm going to ask a very dumb question, which is who hires an applied anthropologist? Like who do you do this work for? And why do they hire you?
So I've done around 250 studies the last 25 years for a lot of big corporations. But I'll give you an example, which is Lego, the toy company that we worked with for over 20 years. And the problem we were solving there was that they were almost going bankrupt. Maybe it's about 20 years ago. And they were going bankrupt because they had the wrong assumption about what success is and what growth is, which was at that point, it's just only about the brand and it's about creating more and more diverse products. And they got a new CEO who was a smart guy. And he said, well, maybe we should figure out why kids play. And if we are the best in the world, it would be a competitive advantage for us to know more about kids than any of our competitors. So they engaged in this 9-month study that we were engaged in to understand not, how kids play, when they play, or where they play, but a much more interesting question, which is why do kids play? So think about that question. Do you have kids?
Yes.
Yeah. So think about not, why do they play? And it's actually a little bit of a mystery why they play, because they don't have to. It's not like a utility, like it play does something. And that's one of the things where senses and understanding the embodiment and all that is really, really important. So they studied kids for 9 months, and that led to a complete change of what they thought about why kids play. So they thought kids played in order to be satisfied. They thought that they had a concept called instant traction, which is a great toy, something that satisfies you very, very fast. So it blinks and says sounds and have wonderful colors. That things should be easy, and that, PlayStation was taking it all at that time, that every play will become digital and so on. And when we then went and did anthropology in kids, so that lived with kids for, a long period and stayed with families and talked about what's it like to be a parent and saw kids when they were playing, we discovered that it was completely wrong assumptions they had, that kids actually have depth when they play. It's not instant traction. They have the same interest for 7 to 9 years. They know everything about dinosaurs or football or basketball or, yeah. And so there's a great deal of depth and complexity and mastery to play. And that led to a different product roadmap for Lego, where they basically cut away around 70% of their products that weren't necessary and spent that money on doing toys that had a very clear proposition around mastery and depth and being engaged in something for a long time. And also the role of creativity in growing up, like really honing in on that, which wasn't really a thing before. Because we basically discovered that play is a way for a kid to discover themselves, and it's a way to socialize and to discover how hard can I hit somebody, what's the hierarchy in this school, in this playground, etc. And Lego wasn't built for that sort of play. So they did all sorts of things. For example, built bigger boxes with much more complex building instructions. They built the first social network for kids. They created a movie that study led to a movie, the first Lego movie, which is all about what is it like to be a kid in a world where adults want to control kids, and how do you break free from that? Playing. So that's an example of a company that used anthropology.
If you were to go to a company, let's say Lego called you up and said, and maybe you would say this is a flawed question, but said, we think that AI will have a increasingly big impact on kids and play in our world. And we are uncertain on how we should figure out how this technology should play a role in our world. How would you kind of compute that question, and where would you apply the anthropologic kind of toolbox? Like, first, you would need to figure out who you should study, would you not?
Yes. And I'd have to figure out a little more about, why do you see that as a problem? Is it really a problem? And what is the problem? And what are your assumptions? So all great insights in my mind come from a gap between how you think the world is and what it really is, what reality is. So in all companies, there are these assumptions that you build your business around, for example, instant traction in the case of Lego. And then there's reality, which is the opposite or often. And it's that gap. So the first thing I do is talk to the company about, what do they assume AI will do? What is it they fear? How do they think it'll play out? And then I'd actually go and study how kids use AI today. What is it used for? Particularly things like AI agents, I think, are really interesting to study, because kids, I know this because I've studied it a little bit, they think about AI in a very, very different way than I, for example, do. It's a much more natural extension of their world than it is for me. So it's not another thing. It's a very big part of being. And then I'll study what they actually do and how it's connected to creativity, play, imagination, of how it unfolds activities like writing, using your hands, how it, how it affects those things. Because we know play is very, very embodied. So the play is very much something you do with your hands. It's not just a mind game. And AI isn't there yet, but maybe, there are many ways that kids, I mean, what we find always with kids is they change the rules. I mean, I once did a study of a digital playground. They made this digital physical playground with 9 stations. And then you're supposed as a kid to go to station 1 and then station 2 and station 3 and do things, right? And then they had a
Right.
system to calculate, and it should take around half an hour to go through all 9 stations. And it did, like the first day and the second day, but the third day, there was a kid that did it in 25 seconds, and they couldn't figure out why. And it turned out that the kids collaborated. So they figured out what each station should do to solve the task. And they stood there, 9 kids, and say, 1, 2, 3, all go, boom,
That's
25
funny.
seconds, right? And that's what childhood is like, I think. And plainness and creativity is really like, which is, and kids are just amazing at that. So I'd be careful having too many assumptions around how AI is dangerous or destroying things. And I'd be much more interested in figuring out how is it used as a companion to kids in their play. I think that would be really interesting to study.
I want to go back to this idea of insight, and I will unabashedly proclaim I don't care if we talk about AI at all in this conversation, because I think your expertise is far more interesting. And I think Henrik and I may actually have some AI-powered ideas that we could contribute if we understand your world better. But I want to come back. I wrote this down. You said all great insights come from a gap between how I think the world is and how it actually is. And I just think that's so beautiful and so profound and so important. And I'd love to give you this word surprise and ask you to talk about, in your practice of applied anthropology, what is the role of surprise? What role does that play? And what do you do with surprises?
That is an amazing question. That is a really good question. I wrote a book about that called The Moment of Clarity. About that moment, there's a moment when you do when you do studies like we do, where you study 90 kids over 9 months, and you get millions of data points, like thousands of photos and what's called field notes and conversations and videos of kids, and you look at all of that and you sort of bombard your brain with all of that. There is a point where the data emerges into a sort of pattern. There are patterns in the data that shows you what's going on. And then there's a moment where all of a sudden you see it. You see, if you're smart enough, and I've seen CEOs do this several times, where all of a sudden they see what's going on. They're surprised, like you said. And it's like a crazy moment, because from then on, it's fairly easy to see what should we do about it. It's when the CEO of Lego discovered that play is about mastery and depth and sociality, it's fairly easy to see for him, okay, we need to make the boxes bigger. Like, that's not like, okay, that's not super creative, but the surprise moment was very difficult. And another one, Jeremy, that I think is so interesting that I've observed, and also in myself, is that I have never gotten to that moment of surprise without pain. It has never happened without sleepless nights, doubting myself, struggling with, can that be true? How does this connect to that? And there's so many people that do research that say, oh, so it's like a linear process. Like, first you get the data, then you find the patterns, and then you have your conclusions. And I think it couldn't be further from the truth. It's almost like doing a painting or writing a book or probably making a film or something like that. With this, there's a moment where you doubt, does this project, will it ever succeed?
Yeah. That's one of my favorite little books on creativity is by an old advertising exec named, I think, James Webb Young. It's like the best $5 you can spend on Amazon. It's called A Technique for Producing Ideas. And one of his critical ingredients or steps, if you will, is hopelessness.
Yeah.
And, or at least that's my read of it. I don't think he actually uses that word, but basically he talks about, you have to your point, bombard your brain so much with information. And then you have to get to the point, you say pain. I can't remember what word he uses, but the way my interpretation of this hopelessness, you have to feel it's impossible. And then he says, you know what you do next? You go to the theater.
Yeah.
You do something totally unrelated, right? But which is just brilliant for another reason. But the point is, I think most problem solvers or creatives, or, when they encounter the roadblock, they think that's evidence I'm doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And what you just suggested is it is an essential precondition to insight. And that to me is so powerful to realize the pain is just like the pain of exercise
Yeah.
is essential to health or fitness. The pain in the problem solving process, you can't deliver truly breakthrough products and services without that pain.
No. And, what's really important with this anthropology thing is that you're not studying it to describe what's going on in itself. You're doing it to think newly about something, think about something in a new way, right? So it's when I have teams that work, so I have teams of people with PhDs and anthropology that go out and do this field work. If they come back and say, oh, it's fairly easy, we think we've got the insights already, then I get really nervous. Then I know this is probably going to be superficial, banal, uninteresting. I'm much more interested in them coming back and saying, it's really hard problem to crack because there are these complexities and all of that. Then I know this is going to be great.
Hmm. Wow. If
Mhm.
it's easy, I get nervous is that's such a great leadership heuristic. I'm concerned if my team says this is too easy.
One
Right.
thing that we talk a lot about on this podcast is what is the thing that humans will do when AI becomes better and better? And different people have different vocabulary around it, and it's
Mm.
all about humanity. And some talk about taste, some people talk about originality or creativity or whatever it is. You have talked about, and I know it's mentioned also in your colleague Christian Masberg's book, Sense Making, about, and this was about big data, but you talked about thick data in that book.
Yeah.
And as I read it through an AI lens, because most of my thinking now go through AI lens, is it was kind of like a pre-AI articulation of the things that people are talking about when it comes to what is the thing that AI currently is not very good at. And some of the examples that I mentioned in the book, as I recall them, are things like the mood in the office is kind of off, or the
Yeah.
party is just getting started.
Yeah.
And those are things that, are innately human, and we will all understand what people will mean when they say that. But it's probably difficult for example, another model to just read a transcript to a point and then extract that from the conversation. So with all that in mind, when you think of people saying, yes, there need to be a human in the loop because there are things that AI won't be good at. Do you buy that? And two, if you buy that, how would you describe or articulate what those things are?
I think it's an evolving field. You know, I'm very impressed. So I use AI personally to do what's called pattern recognition. We used to do that on walls. You'd hang pictures of people and field notes and try to find connections. And you'd spend maybe 3 or 4 weeks making sense of it. And now I can put it into a model and get a rough description of what are the 12, 16 patterns in the data. Not the insights, not the aha surprise, because it can't create that. It's mostly bullshit when it does it, right? And I think it's all getting better. So I, just one note. I think it's super interesting when you're not an engineer or not from the AI world to read about AI, because as an anthropologist, I would say AI is a human constructed phenomenon. It's something we created. It's not made by a machine, and we did it on purpose, right? And often we talk about AI as something that came from space. It didn't. It's something that's been evolving for years and years and years. And there's a culture around it. So that's important. And then I think it's interesting to read, at a Wall Street Journal, where the same paper, the same day says, this is going to displace all jobs in the world. And then on page 3, it would say, and it's a bubble that will break soon. And I kind of go, that's interesting. It can't be both, right?
Huh.
And I think that model of AI is very destructive. That idea of, are we discussing whether it's a bubble or whether it's completely disrupting everything? So I think it's a very destructive way of thinking about AI. I think it's much more interesting to look at AI as synergistic to human skill. and human capability, meaning is something that makes us greater and smarter, but it doesn't replace us.
But why not?
Because we are humans and AI is a machine. And a machine does not have a body. It does not have contextual understanding. It's not born with morale. It doesn't take 18 years to train. A human being is very, very complex. And I think the whole ideal around...
I was just like thinking, so you can't make a baby with 3 women in 3 months?
Exactly.
Exactly.
But just think about how long time it takes to make a baby. There's a reason for it, but that's another story. But I think there's a general tendency to what's called anthropomorphizing, I think it's called, when you assume that the machine you're building is human. So you give it a name and you call it it and him and her and so on. I think that's a mindset that probably will disappear over time when AI becomes more a natural part of our world. And then I don't think we'll even discuss, what's human, what's machine, because it will be very obvious.
A little bit like I think some people on the podcast have described it as electricity.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about it makes it light up in my room, right? It's just like I turn on the lights and it's there.
Can we talk for a second about the tension that you described of you used to spend 3 weeks doing, I picture like a crime scene investigation, everything's up on the wall. You're looking for patterns. You say now AI can give you the 12 to 15 kind of patterns, but you said, and I quote, it can't do the surprise thing. And one, I would just submit to you as a fellow practitioner and student, anytime we find ourselves saying it can't, I have learned myself to say, I haven't taught it how to blank. And so I would just offer that as a gift and as a paradigm. And I wonder what you uniquely with your expertise might be able to do if you thought in terms of, could I train an AI like I train a junior applied anthropologist to be able to do this thing that I think it can't do? So that's kind of just a gift to you.
Yeah.
But my question is, talk for a second about the difference right now. Like, what is the surprise thing in you? And how is that different from what it seems right now the AI can't do? Because one, I'm just interested in understanding. And two, I think if you can articulate it, that might be part of the key to training an AI to do this interesting thing.
Yes, I think we could go quite far with that. So, we have Christian and I, the other founder I work with, we have a pretty big project called Anthropology Without Anthropologists, which is about what you're talking about, like using AI as much as possible to gain insight on human activity and understand social situations, etc. And that includes using video. So we're experimenting with body cameras right now. So we're attaching body cameras to people that have specific disease without an anthropologist being in the room, without a topic guide, without questions, just raw video. Because the problem with anthropologists is that they are in the room and they are biased and they're trained. And most of their theories are Marxist, really, to be honest. It's about power and struggle and dominance and class. And, it's quite good for analytics, but sometimes it's biased. And which I think we've seen plenty of the last couple of years. And so we would love to have an unbiased, clean view of what people do and how they see the world and how they connect and so on. But to answer, so I think that's a fairly ambitious project, and I'm super excited about it because I hope I'll get super surprised and see things that I couldn't see before. In order to train an AI to get to this moment of clarity or moment of insight, you'd have to understand the assumptions, the problem we are starting with. So you'd have to understand.
And your assumptions. And
Yes, yes.
surprise is always, there's a question of relative to what?
Yeah.
And just even as you're talking about surprise, I realize it's relative to my own expectations and understanding. Going back to your definition of insight, right?
Yeah.
There's a gap between what I think the world is
Yes.
and what it actually is. But the important thing there is I.
Mhm.
And the reason perhaps that AI can't deliver the surprise, I'm just riffing right now,
Yeah.
but it can't deliver the same surprises. It has a poor approximation of I.
Yeah.
And then you go, okay, well, if the goal is actually to ask AI, interview, for example, if I'm you, I'm just going to role play as you for a moment,
Yeah. Yeah.
Claude or ChatGPT, interview me as an anthropologist about my understanding of this space and all of my assumptions as an anthropologist seeking to understand an anthropologist's kind of priors.
Right.
Interview me, ask me every question, and then formulate a psychological profile of me as the person reviewing this data.
Yeah.
Now review the data as me and tell me what's surprising to me. I wonder whether that would start to get you there. Because what's interesting is you're saying AI is good at doing the pattern matching. What it's not good at doing is mimicking you. But that's just because you haven't thoroughly thought about how do I get me in there. Anyway, I'm just
Yeah.
riffing, but I think there's something interesting there.
Yeah, absolutely. But my point was just like, let's say you're a company, then you could imagine soon you'd be able to say, go and talk to 2,000 of our employees with
It's
an AI audio interview kind of or conversation thing like you can do with ChatGPT now, and record all that, transcript it, take everything we've ever written about the company, all brand guides, all yearly accounts, all internal meetings, everything we have, and feed it into it, and then tell me what is our three most important assumptions about our customers, for example, or our business, or the world, or whatever, the market, and then you would go and study, people in their context, the way we talked about. But again, not so much by talking to them or interviewing them, but observing how they trying to get into their shoes as much as possible, including the body, how they see the world, how how they're cultured, etc. But I think we can get very close to that, and then you connect those two things and where are the biggest gaps?
That'll be so fascinating, huh?
Yeah,
And there'll probably be big gaps.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. I think there's one thing that's important to say, which is part of doing what we do, what I do, is also an embodied process. It really is. So when I work with a CEO or leadership, it's important that they see the field or the people that we're studying themselves and that they get a embodied sense of surprise. It's not just intellectual.
That is that will so here's as an interesting kind of experiment. I've done this in a number of my entrepreneurship classes and programs. I'll have people brainstorm by themselves, and then I'll have people work with AI to brainstorm, and they generate lots more,
Yeah.
volume and variation and things like that. And then I have them select what they think the highest potential ideas are. It's not all the time, but the vast majority of the time, people select one of the ideas they came up with. They
Oh,
rarely select an AI-driven idea,
interesting.
even though in separate laboratory experiments, according to kind of third-party evaluators, AI's ideas are almost always better from an objective perspective than the human's idea. This is kind of well established now in the literature that AI is capable of generating as good, if not better, ideas, and even experts in particular fields. But the problem was when the human is the one selecting, and if the human objective evaluator knows that it's an AI versus a human idea, they tend to choose the human idea. They tend to overweight the human.
Yeah.
And we, because of our own kind of familiarity with ourselves, we overweight ourselves. It's an interesting question of when you get back, going back to this question of a senior leader having to have the embodied epiphany.
Hmm.
I wonder whether I'm just, again, riffing with you out loud, but I wonder if the question is actually, how do we leverage AI to facilitate the human having the embodied epiphany?
Yeah.
And whereas the embodied epiphany required like, for example, like, there's the IKEA effect, right? Something that you put a little bit of work into, you value more.
Yeah.
So here's an idea. What if you get an AI to generate 95% of the kind of requisite conceptual material, and then you give it to the CEO to then say, what would we call that?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then if they name, I'm just making this up, right? But if they name
No,
it,
no.
would you find that they feel that's embodied sense
Yeah,
of epiphany, right? But if you've taken out 95% of the work and all, but you've learned if I give them 100% fully baked insight, they reject it. But if I
right.
give them a 95% and they've got to like turn the screws on the chair legs, they feel like that's my idea. I don't know. But to
No,
me,
but
it's
you're
an
absolutely
interesting
right.
question.
But it's sort of the feeling that it's my idea, right? It's my
But what
insight,
does it
right?
take to get
Yeah,
to the point that it's your idea? And
yeah.
my personal humble point of view is there's probably a lot of wiggle room to figure out. To me, that's a really fascinating question to
I
actually
can give you a
answer
very concrete
empirically.
example. When we did that Lego study almost 20 years ago, one of the things that fascinated them was there was this kid in Hamburg in Germany. There was a skateboarder. He was 11 years old. And we were talking about, what are the rules of skateboarding? How do you do it? And he was talking about the hierarchy of skateboarders and when you are what's called a king, which is when you can teach other kids how to do a kick flipper, for example. And it's a sort of a hierarchy that's hidden. It's not written everywhere. It's in human nature. But every kid knows it. Like that kid is a king. And then he had a pair of shoes and he took a picture of those shoes and he asked him, what do you think those shoes are worth? And he said, probably €1 million. So why? And then he told me, well, they are thrown in the right place to show I'm a king. So it was an insight. And when you tell the story for most people and you see the picture, you see, oh, there's so much depth to play and to the small hidden symbols that kids have to show each other hierarchy and the pure interest they have in something years after years. The opposite of instant traction, this instant thing that you have a shoe that's worn the right place. That picture of that shoe still hangs in the lobby of Lego's headquarters
That's cool.
because that was a moment of surprise, right? They went,
Yeah.
what? Right. And that became the
Yeah.
symbol.
When you
It's
mention these
beautiful.
things, I'm
Beautiful.
curious what your thought is on synthetic data. Like,
Yes.
if I rendered, you said you were living with you were studying 90 kids for 9 months. Let's assume that I have some models run wild. I asked them to come up with 90 different kids' personalities and then basically have them render both in text and image and voice things that they say and do those 9 months. Would there almost per definition not be an insight there? Because humanity would need to be injected into it? Or do you think there might be an insight, but obviously it'll be a synthetic insight because it was not rendered
Right.
by real humans? Like, where does all this,
No,
what
this is
happens to
this
all
is
this
so
study when
interesting.
suddenly it could be rendered?
I believe that already today the technology is there to do quite a lot with synthetic data and understanding your customers and stuff like that. I do think that the insights you get from that is a very particular set of insights so that it's small problems, not big problems you can solve with that. But there is plenty of small problems. So it's things like pricing and things you do A/B testing on, basically, you could do with synthetic data, I think. In a couple of years, it'll probably be improved when we get what you talked about before. You called it thick data or thick description, which is if you take the eyebrow, it has millions of different ways of moving, and each of them signal anger, love, disgust, surprise, and you can instantly see it because we're human beings, right? It's super hard for an AI today to recognize just the eyebrow and then take the mouth and the smell, sound, history, upbringing, language, and you put that all together and you get a human being. And I don't think we are at the moment in a place where we have anything, we're not close to even 1% of the mystery of what a human being is in terms of training an AI to do that. That doesn't mean that we can't get there, but we need the body, like we need senses. You need eyes, smell, sound, touch, and you need understanding of social connections. So what does it feel like to be a family? It's super hard to describe. And once we have that, I think you can probably build soon synthetic models of particular people, let's say golf players, and predict how they would react to quite a number of things. What if we change the rule of golf? What would happen? Like, you don't have to ask people. It would be able to predict that pretty precisely. And I think you can do the same thing with healthcare in a number of ways. You can do it with traffic. You could do it with public policy. So I think there's a lot of cases where synthetic model of human behavior and human culture can help us progress faster and understand people faster. And also understand things that it'll just take forever to understand for human beings. Because we can't put the patterns together, right? And a good example is, most companies, I think most listeners that work in a company know that they have over the years built what they would call insights. It could be marketing research, it could be studies, it could be surveys, it could be interviews, etc. And they've probably done it 1,000 times. But the data doesn't connect. It's like there and there and there, And one thing that I think is super interesting with synthetic data is, what if a company could take everything it knows about its customers and build into a synthetic model that you can then improve over time, right? I think that is quite interesting, where you have what's called there's multimodal data. So video, audio, text, sales reports, like all kinds of things. And you put it together and make sense of it. I think there's a lot of potential there. And, I don't know how many, maybe but I don't know how many are doing that, but I haven't seen it.
I know a couple of folks who are beginning to test the fringes, maybe folks who we should have on the podcast, Henrik. We can talk about it. And Mikkel, I'm happy to introduce you as well. But to me, I think practically, what's the practical implications of that? One thing I would say is the rate of experimentation is somewhat limited by, test panels and things like that and market research. And if one or an organization could leverage synthetic data to accelerate the rate of experimentation, you can think innovation is basically rate limited by how many experiments we can deploy. And synthetic data represents an incredible opportunity to accelerate experimentation, therefore, but, theoretically accelerate innovation. TBD whether that can be realized, but I know some people who make very strong claims that it can be. So be interesting to study.
Yeah, but also, today we are doing experiments on AI interviews, like using real voice and conversation to talk with, for example, doctors about disease or healthcare and so on. And what's surprising to me is we've tested being interviewed by a human being and being interviewed by an AI. And if you tell people it's an AI that's going to interview you and they know the premise of it, it's actually better data than if a human being does it. It's better at improvising answers. If you can guide and say, please ask open questions, please ask follow-up questions that build on research on what you're talking about. And my anthropologists can't do that. They can't all of a sudden know everything about diabetes,
Right.
And another thing is, very practically, when you're doing an interview and you need to do a test, let's say you want to test a concept of something, a prototype, you'd have to call people, figure out when are you available. You have to enable a video connection. There are all these things, and it takes weeks. Here it's just you press a link. So that means in 24 hours, you could test something on 200 people, pretty deep. And I think if people find it, like the people that are being tested find it entertaining and interesting, and they open up, what's the cost of that? That's great. So I think there's already now there's a whole lot of potential where we don't have to build synthetic models, but use the power of some of these AI tools like audio and video to do things that used to take forever and cost a fortune.
Awesome.
Hey, Mikkel, thank you so much. I find every time I meet Mikkel to kind of leave the conversation with a ton of new thoughts. I hope you
Mhm.
enjoyed, having a
Oh,
conversation with him too.
thank you. No, I mean, it's so rich. I love talking to experts actually in between recording that conversation and right now recording our debrief. Henrik and I were just talking about the power of folks whose expertise lies outside of AI. It to me was incredibly, and I realized halfway through that conversation, Henrik, we should have been recording it because, we're kind of learning and evolving live before our audience. But I think it's so gratifying to be learning from world-class experts like Mikkel. I can think of many others that we have as well, but it was really fun. I mean, to me, his whole definition of insight, I think, is so profound. The gap between what or how we think the world is and how it actually is. The idea of surprises, the moment that you see it, and the embodiedness of that moment. I thought the notion of pain as a prerequisite to solution and insight was really fabulous. So to me, there's something for everybody here, not just about AI, but definitely far beyond about human flourishing, human creativity, problem solving. And then, of course, he said at one point, I wrote down, we don't even understand 1% of what it means to be human, what it means to be a part of a family. I thought, wow, there's so much rich stuff there.
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversations lately that we've had on this podcast is about all these things that we don't understand about humans and how AI is this magnifying glass because we kind of have to tell a robot all these things that we take for granted, right? We mentioned those things like the party's just getting started or the mood is kind of off or like this he seems to be a little bit under the weather. Whatever it is,
Mhm.
we all know what that means. And I think now we're trying to understand how we explain this to robots. We have to understand it ourselves, which is just fascinating. So I just completely agree that it'll be fun increasingly in some of these podcasts to talk to experts that know something very specific and then ask them about AI and really
Uh-huh.
start to kind of evolve our thinking about AI, but not necessarily about just talking about AI, but talking about
Right.
kind of like the world in general through the lens of AI, which
I don't think, I mean, what's interesting, what I see again and again and again is the fact that they're an expert in some area, in some ways, they're uniquely qualified to comment on AI, but other ways, they're just as prone to misunderstandings and bias as much as
hey,
the rest. And I think that, it's generally true that humans want their expertise to be unique to them and want it to be irreplicable. And I'm always skeptical when I hear an expert say, but it can't do this really special thing that I do yet. And,
hmm,
you heard me challenge him, I think, hopefully respectfully. But I hear this from so many experts in so many fields that, can do all these other things. But this unique thing that I do, it can't do it yet. And I really think that paradigm shift, from assuming it can't do it to taking responsibility and saying, I haven't thought about training it or I haven't sufficiently trained it.
hmm,
At the very least, it's a really powerful reframe to improve the performance of models. But the reality is AI will perform to your expectations. And if you have low expectations, it will perform poorly, not because it can't perform well, but because you don't want it to.
yeah,
And so to me, it's almost like a Rorschach or whatever, right? It's like
interesting.
it's it ends up being a fulfillment of what you see and what you expect. And I just think like one message that I find myself reiterating again and again and again is some version of expect more,
Yeah.
raise your expectations, assume what if it could do it? And by the way, like if you think about in a world of disruption and startups, things like that, imagine for a moment there's a team of hungry, scrappy entrepreneurs who are spending all of their energy getting an AI to try to do that thing, right? Or trying to get an AI to do it. It's like the default isn't the status quo and the default isn't nothing changes. The default is everything is changing and you get to be a cause in the matter and contribute to it or get blindsided by it potentially.
Yeah, I think, and meanwhile, I think the world of anthropology is probably is a conservative kind of group of folks, right? And probably like human based. And
Sure.
knowing
No,
Christian and
I
Mikkel
mean, anthropology without anthropologists is like, that's such a profound
and
frame, even
knowing some of the
on the
projects they're
practice.
working on, like they're definitely, I think, very ambitious with what they can use AI for. So I think you're right though, that you have to really be playful with what you want to use it for to kind of like start to see its limits. But obviously
Mhm.
there's limits
Mhm.
too. I
Yeah.
also I was fascinated by. I was kind of like ready for him to poo-poo all over synthetic data. I would imagine somebody spent his whole career like looking at people. It's like, well, I have to look at people, and
Right.
on the contrary, it's like, oh yeah, I think that's a lot of like maybe small problems to start with, but over time, bigger problems. I thought that was fascinating too.
Well, and even his comment that actually AI interviewers are better than his own
Yeah,
human anthropologists. I was not expecting him to say that. I feel like that
uh,
we could have an entire follow-up conversation just on that topic.
that's
Maybe
awesome.
you should get his partner Christian to continue the conversation.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Can I make a request live on the air that I don't know if I don't know how much overlap their expertise is, but if they're working together, I think this conversation just kind of stimulated so much more curiosity in me. I would love the chance to
No, I'd
continue it.
love to get Christian. I'm a big fanboy of his partner, so I'll go and do my appropriate baking.
All right. Sounds good. Let me know if you need
Awesome.
to take my reputation for a spin. Let's go.
Okay, Jeremy Oddly, I think with that, we will end out and we will try to beg people to share this episode with somebody that they think might not really think about AI in like a classic term and want it to kind of, yeah, maybe like into what are you doing? You're
I
doing
want to
something
make
that
sure to
has,
get the hashtag, the code word
oh, the
hashtag
code.
is without anthropologists.
Okay, so that's the password. If
Clearly.
you hear it all the way to the end, send us a note, and we'll send you a gift. We'll send you one. We'll send you one of our books each.
There you go.
There you go.
Each. Wow. Can we not
There you go.
alternate for crying out loud? Okay, that's a
Okay,
good idea.
maybe
We'll
we'll.
do it. We'll do it. Send us a note. We'll do it.
And with that, bye bye.
Bye bye.